In the 3rd year of my marriage to Simon Zhao, he brought a young woman home. Melissa, you should learn from these young girls. Stop being so dull like a piece of wood. I calmly shattered our wedding photo and handed him the divorce papers I had long prepared. Simon, let's divorce. I'll step aside and make room for her. His friends all predicted that I would end up starving on the streets without him. Simon thought the same. Once she's out there and has had enough of the hardships, she'll realize how lucky she was to be Mrs. Zhao. But a week passed, then a month, and I never looked back. Simon grew uneasy, restless, unable to find peace day or night. One night, in the depths of his despair, he drunkenly showed up at my new place, banging on the door. Melissa, you just want money. I'll give you whatever you want. The door opened to reveal a stranger, shirtless, wearing only sleep pants, with fresh scratch marks on his torso. Anthony raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed. Mr. Zhao, what the hell are you doing at my wife's door in the middle of the night? Chapter 1. At the private club in Jean City, Simon had long reserved the most luxurious and secluded penthouse suite. I took off my coat, draped it over my arm, steadied myself, and walked forward. The double wooden doors with intricate carvings opened, and the first person I saw was Simon. His silver-gray shirt was half unbuttoned, and his tie was nowhere to be seen. The girl sitting on his lap was feeding him peeled grapes. He pushed her hand away, though his expression suggested he was enjoying it. Is that sister-in-law? Sister-in-law, come on in. Someone noticed me and quickly stood up to greet me. The girl in Simon's arms was startled and hurried to get off his lap, but Simon held her in place. You stay right here. The girl looked at me nervously, unable to move as Simon's arm tightened around her waist. Her face slowly turned pale with fear. Simon lazily smiled again. What are you all saying? Who's your sister-in-law? The only sister-in-law here is the one sitting on my lap. Everyone froze, not knowing what to say. Simon. I called his name, but he simply closed his eyes, refusing to look at me. The atmosphere grew unbearably awkward. Someone tried to break the tension. Why don't you come in and sit down? Brother Shin is drunk. He's not himself right now. No need. I just have a few words to say. Then I'll leave. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. Simon opened his eyes, his gaze cold and distant. You want more money? How much this time? 100,000, 200,000, or 1,000,000? Chapter 2. The room fell silent. For a moment, I really wanted to turn around and leave, but the last bit of reason held me in place. I lowered my gaze, staring at my toes. My throat felt glued shut, and my voice came out hoarse and cracked. My brother isn't doing well. He was just sent to the ICU and needs 300,000 yuan. Simon clicked his tongue, casting a just as I expected glance at everyone. His long fingers toyed with the hair of the girl in his lap. Melissa, since we got married, how many times have I given you 300,000 yuan? Have you ever made me happy? I'll give you the money, but it has to be on my terms, don't you think? Fighting back the tears of humiliation, I gritted my teeth and looked up at him. What do you want me to do? Simon raised an eyebrow and smiled. I can see you're capable. You came to ask me for money but made sure to dress up nicely. That shows you're not as clueless as you pretend to be. His dark eyes reflected a cold cruelty. What's the difference between you and them? Oh, at least those girls don't pretend to be as proper and righteous as you do. The tears surged up, and I turned, fleeing from the room in panic. Simon, that was too much. Yeah, did you see how she cried just now? She really looked pitiful. What? Do you feel sorry for her? Simon's voice suddenly grew colder. Actually, sister-in-law is pretty great. She's beautiful, quiet, and does everything well. Yeah, if you want, I can give her the 300,000 instead. Hey, Simon, what are you doing? Don't go too far. The sound of a bottle smashing and men shouting faded into the background as I ran. When I reached the elevator, I collapsed against the wall, utterly drained, and the tears finally fell like rain. Chapter 3. After 3 years of marriage, I knew Simon played around outside. He had grudgingly agreed to the marriage arrangement between the Zhao and Su families. Before the wedding, the girl he loved, Diana, had died in a diving accident. He thought it was the doing of me and the Sue family, and that only fueled his hatred for me. After the wedding, he disappeared without a trace. 3 months later, he returned with a strange girl by his side. Over the next 2 years, I lost count of how many girlfriends he had. All of them bore some resemblance to Diana, but this was the first time he brought that girl, Patricia, into our home. When I returned from the hospital, I noticed the servants giving me strange looks. It wasn't until I went upstairs to our bedroom that I understood why. Simon was lying on our marital bed. Patricia was sitting beside him, dutifully feeding him water. When she saw me enter, the girl nearly jumped up in fright. Mrs. Zhao. Mr. Zhao was just drunk. I stood at the door and waved my hand. Take good care of him. But that's not right. You're his wife. You should be the one taking care of him. It's fine. He likes you. So if you take care of him, he'll be happy. I smiled, turned around, and walked out of the room. Melissa! But Simon suddenly called out to me, holding Patricia close. He narrowed his eyes at me. Where are you going? You should learn from these young girls how to take care of your man. Stop being so cold. You can't even kiss properly. He didn't finish his sentence because the sound of a picture frame shattering suddenly echoed through the room. It was our wedding photo, now lying in pieces on the floor. My face was expressionless as I looked at him. Anything else you want to say? Simon pushed Patricia away and slowly sat up. Melissa, think carefully about what you're doing. I curled my lips into a slight smile, took out the divorce papers I had long prepared, and handed them to him. Sign them. Simon, let's get divorced. I'll make room for her. Melissa, once you start this, there's no going back. Sign them and let me know when it's done. With that, I didn't look at him again, turned, and left the room, heading downstairs. As I walked out the door, Simon stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at me. Melissa, it's easy to leave, but it won't be so simple to come back. I didn't look back, nor did I respond. Dragging my suitcase, I walked into the deep, dark night. Chapter 4. Early winter in Beijing is cold. I tightened my coat around me and bought a small bottle of liquor from a convenience store. I also stopped by a street stall to eat a large bowl of spicy hot pot. Most of my money was already deposited into the hospital account. After searching through all my belongings, I found I only had 300 yuan left. To avoid freezing on the streets, I needed to find a cheap motel to stay in. As I scrolled through my phone, looking for an affordable place, a man's voice suddenly sounded beside me. Mind if I join you? I didn't look up. Go ahead. The man sat down next to me, and out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the fabric of an expensive coat. Surprised, I finally looked up at him. The man was openly staring at me. I frowned, but Anthony's gaze grew bolder. Miss Sue, it's midnight. You're dressed so nicely. And you've been drinking. Aren't you afraid someone might take advantage of you? Beijing's pretty safe. No need for you to worry. I put my phone away and got up to leave, dragging my suitcase behind me. But Anthony stood up too. Where are you going at this hour? I noticed the motels you were looking at are too cheap and unsafe. Why don't I book a hotel for you instead? I didn't respond, just walked faster with my suitcase in tow. Hey, watch out! You're not even looking at the cars. A car sped past, and Anthony grabbed my wrist, pulling me close to him. I quickly shook off his hand. What do you want? Just trying to help a friend. Help me, or just sleep with me? I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Anthony, I get it. I turned you down before, and now you want revenge. Revenge? The usual playful smile in Anthony's eyes slowly disappeared. Is that really what you think? What else? The cold wind made my stomach churn, and I doubled over, vomiting. The pain twisted through my gut, and by the time I was done, I was too weak to stand. Anthony gently patted my back, wiping my mouth with a tissue. His pants and shoes were dirty from the mess, but he didn't seem to care. I squatted on the ground, unable to hold back my tears. Why does everyone keep bullying me? Why does this keep happening to me? You're all horrible people, all of you. Melissa. Anthony's voice was soft but sincere as he gently stroked my back. I'm not bullying you. I never intended to hurt you. I just returned to the country and heard a little about what's been going on. I couldn't stop thinking about it and was worried. When you left Zhao's house tonight, I followed you. I didn't have any other intentions. Just didn't want anything bad to happen to you. If you don't want to see me, I can call someone else to come get you. I have no friends. After everything that happened to my family, I lost all my friends. Chapter 05. Anthony was silent for a moment before speaking again. So, should I contact your husband to pick you up? We're divorced. I've already signed the divorce papers, leaving with nothing. I gave a bleak smile, swaying slightly as I stood up. He wasn't wrong. Over the past 3 years, I did spend quite a lot of his money. Let's just leave it at that. We owe each other nothing. Do you still love him? I paused, then shook my head immediately. No, I don't. I stopped loving him a long time ago. Anthony, I'm not that pathetic. Melissa, then can you try to like me? I turned back, surprised, and looked at Anthony. Don't you hate me? When I rejected him back then, I was young and reckless, and my words were harsh. Anthony shook his head. Over the years, he had matured from the impulsive youth he once was. Time had shaped him into someone steady and handsome, with a calm demeanor that seemed to surpass even Simon's. I thought about hating you, but in the end, I couldn't bring myself to. Anthony took a step closer to me. Melissa, why don't you give it a try with me? Perhaps my silence made him add with a smile. Even if it's just to get back at him, you can still play with me. There was a casual smile in his eyes, as if he was truly just joking around, as if he didn't mean it seriously at all. But in those dark pupils, there was a light that warmed my heart. I suddenly couldn't bear to look directly at him. Let's go back to the hotel. You don't look well. You should rest. Anthony took my suitcase and held out his hand to me. Don't fall. Lean on me. Chapter 06. After we returned to the hotel and he made sure I was settled, Anthony was about to leave. At that moment, I had just taken a relaxing hot bath and changed into a soft, warm robe. Even my long hair had been patiently dried by him. As he walked to the door, I suddenly called out to him, Anthony. When he turned to look at me, I stood on my tiptoes, wrapped my arms around his neck, and kissed him. The first time I kissed Simon, he said I was like a piece of wood, completely uninteresting. He pushed me away and left immediately, but now I had learned to kiss, and it was with a man I had never considered before. The moment I opened my mouth, Anthony suddenly took control. His burning hand tightly gripped my waist, and he flipped me over, pinning me against the door. As his domineering and forceful kiss fell, tears slowly welled up in the corners of my eyes. Melissa, don't cry. Anthony held me tightly, so I didn't see the darkness in his eyes. When you cry, I lose all my boundaries. Even if you're just playing with me, Melissa, I'll accept it. Chapter 07. The night was very quiet. It was early winter, but somewhere there was still a faint scent of osmanthus. Tiny osmanthus flowers drifted into the lake, causing slight ripples to spread out, one circle after another, like something wrapping around a person's heart. Anthony was utterly overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events that he had never dared to imagine. Tightly wound threads seemed to constrict his heart, cutting into his flesh. It hurt, but it felt exhilarating. He held Melissa like that, holding her very, very tightly, his face buried in her neck, his eyes burning, and even his tear ducts ached with the pressure. Melissa. He wished he could merge the person in his arms into his own flesh and blood, but in the end, all he could do was tremble as he asked in a low, hoarse voice by her ear, "Does it still hurt?" Melissa continued to cry silently. Anthony kissed her wet eyelids again. "Then I'll leave, please. Don't cry anymore, okay?" But Melissa shook her head and held onto his waist even tighter. At that moment, Anthony couldn't help but think, even if she asked for his life, he wouldn't hesitate for a second. Chapter 08. It was still the top-floor suite of Golden City. The atmosphere was lively when Simon suddenly threw down his cards. "You guys continue. I'm going out for some fresh air." Patricia was startled for a moment and quickly got up to follow him. But Simon spoke coldly. "Don't follow me." He grabbed a cigarette and walked out to the balcony to light it. Then, he unlocked his phone. There were no messages from Melissa, not even any activity on the household card he had given her. It was then that Simon remembered that in the 3 years of marriage, Melissa had only asked him for money 3 times. The first time was a year after the Sue family's downfall, when her older brother Angelo had a severe accident. She had exhausted all her savings but still couldn't gather enough money. The second time was when Angelo couldn't accept his paralysis and attempted suicide, nearly dying in the process. The third time was during her last visit to Golden City, when she left in tears. The reason he was so harsh with his words that time was that it was the anniversary of Diana's death. His mood had been utterly terrible, and he had lashed out without thinking, but he never imagined that Melissa would actually ask for a divorce. She had even prepared the divorce papers, signed them, and was willing to leave with nothing. "Simon, have you heard anything from your wife yet?" Simon took a drag of his cigarette, chuckling lightly. "Let her pretend. But don't worry too much. With the way the Sue family is now, she won't last long after leaving you. Her brother's situation is a bottomless pit." This was the primary reason Simon was certain that Melissa wouldn't dare to actually divorce him. Melissa was deeply attached to Angelo. She would never abandon him. Thinking of Angelo, Simon's slightly restless heart suddenly calmed down. He stubbed out his cigarette and said nonchalantly, "Let her suffer a bit and hit some walls. She'll realize how comfortable it is to be Mrs. Zhao. In a few days, it's our old man's birthday. You should bring your wife along, right? Just give her a way out. Women, after all, soften when you coax them." His friend sighed, adding, "Look at Diego, Eva and Alex are all lovey-dovey in Hong Kong. And what kind of shape has Diego been in this past year?" Simon's hand, resting on the railing, suddenly clenched tightly. Seeing the slight change in his expression, his friend boldly took Simon's phone, unlocked it with his face, and dialed Melissa's number. Simon didn't stop him. Perhaps deep down, he wanted to make this call. Unfortunately, the call went through, but all they heard was a mechanical voice. "The number you have dialed is temporarily unavailable." Great. Simon couldn't help but let out a cold laugh. Melissa had blocked him. Chapter 09. His friend was surprised. "Maybe it's just bad reception. Let me try again." "No need." Simon grabbed his phone with a cold expression and started walking back toward the private room. But just as he was about to reach the door, his phone rang with an incoming call. "Mr. Zhao, I went to the hospital today to visit Mr. Su, but they told me he was discharged yesterday." Simon froze in his tracks. "What did you say?" "Angelo, a man paralyzed in bed, who had arranged for his discharge." The Su family had long since fallen apart, scattered to the winds. Melissa had only this one close relative left. So, if anyone had done it, it had to be her. But with Angelo's condition, stopping treatment, he wouldn't survive for long. Did Melissa care so little about her brother's life just to fight with him? "Simon, what's going on?" "Angelo's been discharged." "No way." His friend was shocked. Can he even be discharged in his condition? Simon's face remained expressionless. "It doesn't matter. It's none of my business." "Simon, isn't Melissa determined to divorce me?" Simon smiled. "So what does Angelo have to do with me?" "Maybe you should try to contact your wife. Don't let this turn into something serious." Simon pushed open the door to the room, his voice icy. "No one is allowed to contact her. Anyone who does can consider our friendship over." Chapter 10. When I left the hospital, it was already late. Seeing me come downstairs, Anthony, who had been leaning against the car, immediately stubbed out his cigarette. I paused slightly, looking at him through the somber night. Since that night, our relationship had become quite delicate. Anthony had helped with my brother's situation, covering the expenses as well, although I insisted on writing an IOU. Wanting to keep our relationship strictly professional, Anthony clearly didn't see it that way. After my brother was transferred to South City, Anthony first introduced me to his close friends. Unlike Simon's friends, they called me Melissa or Miss Sue. Though their tone was polite and formal, I could sense the sincerity and respect in their words. It was different from Simon's friends, who called me sister-in-law but never really treated me as one. Besides, who knows how many women they had called sister-in-law? Tired? Anthony walked up to me. The caregivers and rehabilitation therapists we hired are very professional and responsible. You don't have to do everything yourself. I only have this one relative left. This is the only thing I can do for him now. Anthony smiled. Some things are better left to the professionals. Melissa, have you ever thought about doing something you love? I was a bit dazed. Yes. Ever since my family and then my brother encountered trouble, I had been spinning like a top, with no life of my own. My former hobbies, my dreams, had all faded into oblivion. I noticed your brother's condition seems to be improving since leaving the capital. Maybe it's time for you to start focusing on yourself again. What could I do? I looked at Anthony, confusion evident in my eyes. These past 3 years, I feel like I've fallen out of touch with society, but the things you learned from childhood can be easily picked up again. Melissa, you could start playing the violin again. You could paint traditional Chinese paintings and hold exhibitions. Anthony looked at me, a smile gradually spreading across his face. You could even open your own design studio, specializing in custom-made kipeos. You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen wearing a qipao. Can I? It felt like something deep inside me was stirring. Everything Anthony mentioned was something I had once loved, but I hadn't touched a violin or a paintbrush in 3 years. After getting married, I had wanted to work and earn money, but Simon wouldn't allow it. It was as if he was determined to trap me in the Zhao family, forever under his control, dependent on his whims. Why not? Anthony took my hand, leading me forward. At the very least, I'll always be here to catch you if you fall, but I already owe you so much money. Anthony, turning these hobbies into a business, each one is a money pit. Melissa, I'm a businessman. In business terms, you're a good investment. I won't lose out. Let me think about it, okay? Of course. Anthony opened the car door and helped me in. But for now, I want to take you to do something very important. What is it? I'm taking you to see the sea, to swim, to dive. Chapter 11. My eyes widened suddenly, and the color drained rapidly from my face. Unconsciously, my fingers began to tremble violently. The girl Simon loved, Diana. She came from an ordinary family, kind and beautiful. After news of my engagement to Simon spread, she went to the seaside to clear her mind in a bad mood. There was an accident while she was diving, and she couldn't be saved. After Diana's death, Simon's attitude toward me changed dramatically, and at that time, I foolishly believed that the truth would prevail. I hadn't done anything wrong, so I had a clear conscience. The truth would eventually come to light. But once prejudice takes root in the heart, how can it be easily changed? Diana's body was only found 3 days later. I was there that day as well. That day, Simon left me alone on the coral reef. It wasn't until the tide started to rise that a lifeguard picked me up and took me to a rescue boat. Since then, I've been terrified of anything related to the sea. I can't go. Anthony, I'm afraid of the water. Lissa. Anthony leaned down to fasten my seatbelt. Then he looked at me, his eyes focused and serious. Don't punish yourself for someone else's mistakes. You did nothing wrong, so there's no need to be afraid. You're an excellent swimmer, and you love the sea. Why not go? I shook my head, pale-faced, with a bitter smile. In my youth, I thought that since I liked Simon and we were engaged, we should get married and become husband and wife. He gave up on Diana himself and chose to marry me. So, I wasn't at fault. But later, those endless days and nights of torment and pain told me otherwise. Marrying a man who doesn't love you, who has someone else in his heart, is the greatest mistake. Lissa, it was he who didn't dare defy his family to marry the woman he loved. The fault lies with him, not with you. Anthony gently cupped my face, wiping away the traces of tears from the corners of my eyes. Don't take on sins that don't belong to you. You must always love yourself the most, even more. The sea is so beautiful, and it has done nothing wrong. Why not go and see it? Chapter 12. Anthony eventually took me to the seaside. The vastness of the earth and sky, the boundless ocean, highlighted the smallness of humanity. He encouraged me to take off my shoes and walk into the shallow water with him. The seawater was a bit chilly, and my calves began to cramp slightly. But Anthony's hand was warm and strong, supporting me like an unyielding fortress. I gradually relaxed, lifting my skirt as I started to playfully step on the small waves. At some point, Anthony let go of my hand, and I didn't even notice. It wasn't until a larger wave rolled in and I stumbled, nearly falling, that I panicked. I looked around frantically, instinctively calling his name. Anthony, Lissa, I'm here. His warm, broad hand gripped my fingertips tightly, and then, with my skirt soaked through, he pulled me into his embrace. In that moment, the world fell silent, as if a long-lost soul had finally found redemption. Chapter 13. On the third day, Anthony took me diving. I was too afraid to venture into the deeper waters, so I didn't get to see the full beauty of the ocean's depths. But for me, this was already a huge breakthrough. On our last day, we lay on the deck, basking in the sun. I can't remember who initiated the kiss first, but that kiss was long, and it made my heart flutter. The seaside villa allowed us to feel the ocean breeze. We could also hear the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. Anthony coaxed me into drinking a bit of red wine. As I grew slightly tipsy, he lifted me to sit on the balcony railing. I still felt uneasy about the sea, and I was terrified of the sensation of being high up with nothing to hold onto behind me. All I could do was cling tightly to his neck, my legs wrapping around his slim waist. He laughed softly into my ear. Lissa, why are you trembling? I'm scared. The railing is so narrow. I'm going to fall. Anthony, with me here, how could I let you fall? He lowered his head and gently kissed my ear. The tingling sensation made my entire back and neck feel as though tiny electric currents were crawling over them. I was dizzy and overwhelmed. If you keep this up, I'm not talking to you anymore. I tried to push him away, but he mischievously pretended to let go. I screamed in fear, clinging to him tightly. All right, let's go back inside. His laugh was deep and joyful as he easily lifted me in his arms. That night was our second time. I was still very nervous. I've always been afraid of pain since I was a child. Lissa, Anthony leaned down, intertwining our fingers. His kiss landed on my brow. Close your eyes and relax. Anthony, I'll love you well. Lissa. There was pure sincerity in Anthony's handsome eyes. His pupils were dark, and when he looked at me, there was always a soft light that made my heart melt. I didn't respond, only closing my eyes gently as he instructed. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the waves crashed violently against the rocks, shattering into foam. I felt like a small boat drifting on the dark sea, carried by the waves, riding the crest of the tide. The only difference was that this little boat would eventually sail out of the storm and into a large, warm harbor. Chapter 14. When Simon woke up from his dream again, it was already 4 a.m. This was the villa in No. 1 Courtyard, the home he and Melissa had shared as their marital residence. The day Melissa left, winter had just begun in Beijing. Now, the second snowfall of the season had already blanketed the city. In his dream just now, Simon saw Diana, with red-rimmed eyes, asked him, Simon, are you forgetting me? Have you already started to fall for Melissa? He slowly sat up in bed, waiting for his emotions to settle. In truth, he had long known that Diana's death was just an accident, and Melissa was innocent. Perhaps subconsciously, he had already anticipated that he would develop feelings for Melissa. That's why he acted so irrationally, trying to nip those feelings in the bud. But things eventually spiraled out of control. Who wouldn't be moved by a woman like Melissa? Even his friends, even Diego, had more than once told him to forget Diana and focus on building a life with Melissa. He had actually considered it, too, but by the time he had that thought, Melissa's heart had already been covered in a layer of ice that wouldn't melt. When he came home drunk, she still took care of him, but she would subtly avoid his touch. She wouldn't let him kiss her, and she no longer stayed in the same room with him. She even gently smiled and asked him if he wanted to call his girlfriend. This endlessly good-tempered woman was the one who ultimately shattered their wedding photo and signed the divorce papers, walking away with nothing. Chapter 15. Simon found himself increasingly out of control, increasingly uneasy. He started to lose focus at his friends' gatherings. He began to feel uncomfortable with everything in his home, even the food. Everything was still as orderly as it had been when Melissa was there. The maids and housekeepers continued to follow Melissa's instructions, but nothing felt right. The combination of his shirts and ties was always off. The humidity and temperature in the room were never as comfortable as when she was home. He even forgot what clothes Melissa used to prepare for him when it snowed in Beijing. As a result, he caught 2 bouts of the flu in a row, unable to avoid them. When he was feverish and delirious, there was no longer the perfectly tempered honey water at his bedside. No one was there to stay up all night, caring for him without rest. The kitchen staff didn't know that when he was sick and had no appetite, this usually mild eater would crave something sour and spicy. Nothing was as it should be. This caused Simon's illness to linger for nearly a week before he slowly recovered. And the first thing he did when he started to feel better was to have his personal assistant investigate Angelo's transfer. He knew Angelo was the person Melissa cared about most. As long as he treated Angelo well, a smart woman like Melissa should understand that he was trying to make amends. Chapter 16. The studio I rented is located just below the office building of Anthony's company. The previous tenant also ran a design studio there. So, with a few simple adjustments to the decor, it was quickly ready for use. The studio isn't large, and it's somewhat modest. Anthony wasn't too pleased with it, but I insisted on renting it. I didn't want to owe him too much financially. Since our return from the seaside, the relationship between us seemed to have started drifting away from the course I originally intended. But the more this happened, the more I wanted to become financially independent. After the studio opened, I received my first order. It was from Alicia, the first female friend I made after coming to South City with Anthony. She was about to get engaged, and all her dresses had already been prepared. But perhaps to support my new business, Alicia specifically asked me to design a custom qipao. She planned to wear it at her engagement party. I took my first order very seriously. I personally drafted, sketched, made patterns, selected fabrics, threads, buttons, and accessories. This led to many late nights, often working through the night, but the busyness made me feel fulfilled and happy. However, Anthony was becoming increasingly resentful. Finally, after waiting until 1 a.m. again, when Anthony picked me up from the studio to take me back to the apartment, he couldn't hold back any longer. Lissa, have you noticed that your dark circles are getting worse lately? Staying up late is taking a toll on you. I think you even have a pimple on your chin. When he mentioned it, I looked closely in the mirror. It did seem like I was a bit worn out. Alicia's engagement is coming up soon. I'm afraid I won't finish in time. So I've been staying up late. Once Alicia's qipao is done, and I hire some staff, the studio won't be this busy anymore. Anthony glanced over at me while driving. Have you noticed any changes in me lately? I looked at him carefully, still handsome, with a high bridge nose and sharp features. Due to the long wait, a faint shadow of stubble had appeared on his square jaw, making his masculine allure even more intense. After staring at him for a while, I inexplicably started to feel a bit embarrassed. Nothing seems to have changed. You look the same as before. Anthony kept one hand on the steering wheel while the other held mine. Melissa, can't you see that my face is covered in dissatisfaction? And the desolation of a man being ignored by his own woman? Chapter 17. When he said those words, his tone was low. In the confined space of the car, the intimate atmosphere grew quickly. I felt my cheeks heat up and tried to pull my hand away. But he only held it tighter. Will you let me stay over tonight? My face was burning, and I couldn't help but turn to look out the window. A black Bentley sped past, giving me a strange sense of familiarity. But the thought quickly vanished. Someone as proud and self-assured as Simon would never come to South City. Lissa? Anthony's voice carried a hint of hurt. I thought about how hard these past few days had been for him. He was already swamped with his own work. But no matter how late his meetings or how exhausting his days were, he always made sure to pick me up after work. And because he was considerate of how tired I was, afraid that his early rising would wake me, he would always drive back late at night after dropping me off at my apartment. I lowered my head, my eyes falling on his long, well-defined fingers. Unbidden, thoughts of what those hands could do filled my mind, causing a fresh wave of embarrassment. The heat in my cheeks refused to dissipate. I turned my face away again and cracked the window slightly. Cold wind blew in, carrying a few snowflakes that landed on my face. I heard myself speak, my voice low, but with a soft intimacy. "It's snowing. Why don't you stay at my place tonight? Just for the night." The apartment I rented was small, something Anthony had never been satisfied with. I knew he wanted me to stay with him, but I wasn't sure what I was holding on to. Stubbornly refusing his offer, he always relented in the end, letting me have my way. Then, "Thank you, Miss Sue, for your kind hospitality." Anthony's laugh was deep and joyful. He brought my hand to his lips and pressed a deep kiss onto it. Chapter 18. Simon's car sped through the snow-covered streets, where the headlights touched. Snow flurries danced in the air. The bustling, glittering avenue was still full of traffic. This was a different kind of splendor than that of Beijing. Angelo was now placed in the best private rehabilitation hospital in South City, and he had heard that Melissa had just opened her own design studio. He still remembered how well Melissa played the violin, and how her painting skills were widely praised. He thought that now, free from financial worries, she would choose to return to being a carefree young lady with time for the finer things in life. But he never expected that she would rent a space of less than 50 square meters, diligently running her small business. Nor did he expect that the apartment she was now renting was so modest. It seemed that the man helping her didn't care for her as much as he should. Thinking this, Simon felt that the turmoil in his heart, like oil boiling over a flame, had slightly calmed. But what he didn't know was that this brief peace would shatter into laughable pieces in just 20 minutes. Chapter 19. The moment we stepped through the door, I had just taken off my coat when Anthony pressed me against the door. Underneath my coat, I was wearing a crimson cheapao. Anthony had a particular fondness for seeing me in a cheapao. Every time I wore one, he would go absolutely wild. Tonight was no exception. "Lissa," his breath grew increasingly heated as he kissed me. "You haven't showered yet." I tried to push him away, but it was in vain. "We'll shower together afterward." "Anthony!" I pounded on his chest in frustration, but all it elicited was a few deep chuckles from him. To make matters worse, he kissed me while effortlessly tearing my new cheapao with one hand. "Anthony!" I bit him in anger. I had just put on this dress, and I really liked it. "I'll buy you 100 more, okay?" Chapter 20. The doorbell rang persistently, even as Anthony had yet to be satisfied. I was utterly exhausted, my body feeling completely drained. I didn't know who it was, ringing the doorbell so insistently without getting tired. I pushed Anthony, urging him to see if something was wrong. He gave me another deep kiss before reluctantly getting out of bed, pulling on a pair of sweatpants as he walked toward the door, his expression turning cold. Through the peephole, Anthony instantly recognized Simon, but he deliberately pretended not to know him and opened the door. Simon had clearly been drinking heavily. Otherwise, he might have still maintained his lofty, aristocratic demeanor. As the door opened, Simon extinguished his cigarette. "Melissa, isn't it money you want? I'll give you everything. From now on, all my money is yours. I didn't sign the divorce papers. I won't let you leave with nothing. We won't get divorced. We'll make this work." All the things he had thought about for so long on the way there. In the end, he couldn't bring himself to say. What came out instead were the same hurtful words he had repeated for 3 years, words that had become second nature. But Simon didn't even have time to regret his slip of the tongue, because the person who opened the door wasn't Melissa. It was a man who was somewhat unfamiliar to him. Chapter 21. If Simon was initially shocked and stunned when he saw Anthony, that shock turned into something else entirely when he noticed Anthony shirtless, wearing only a pair of sleep pants, with fresh scratch marks on his toned waist and abdomen. In that moment, Simon's emotions completely unraveled. "Who the hell are you? What are you doing here? Where's Melissa?" Simon's eyes were bloodshot, burning with an intense, almost frightening red. His gaze flicked from the man's body, searching behind him, but as his eyes moved, they caught sight of the tangled clothing scattered across the floor. A crimson cheapao, a white lace slip, sheer stockings, a man's shirt, a black tie, a discarded belt. The belt buckle reflected a blinding glint of light, stabbing at his eyes and piercing his heart. His entire body trembled, his teeth chattering faintly. Even his pupils seemed to lose focus for a moment. In 3 years of marriage, he had never touched Melissa. He had clung to that absurd boundary, convincing himself that by doing so, he wasn't betraying Diana. He couldn't see his own heart. No, maybe he had deliberately refused to see it, and when he finally forced himself to face everything, it was already too late. Anthony looked at the drunken man in front of him. He wasn't bad-looking, but he appeared pale, haggard, and frail. No wonder Melissa had remained a pure and innocent girl after 3 years of marriage. Yet, knowing that Melissa had once genuinely liked him, Anthony couldn't help but feel a surge of jealousy. He raised an eyebrow, his eyes filled with lingering displeasure, his voice hoarse. "Mr. Zhao, why are you showing up at my wife's place in the middle of the night? What's the matter with you?" Chapter 22. Simon had never called Melissa by anything other than her name. His friends affectionately called her sister-in-law. Even his girlfriends would graciously address her as little sister-in-law. Some people would call her Miss Sue. That title always seemed to evoke a distant memory of her carefree life as a young woman, of the feelings between them that had long since faded away. Simon felt a deep, aching discomfort. It wasn't just physical, it was a mental anguish. He didn't even have the energy to muster anger. His shoulders slumped, and he stood there in a state of despondency. The past years flashed through his mind like a carousel of memories. The little girl who once followed behind him, sweetly calling him brother. Later, she grew into a beautiful, gentle young woman. Her heart and eyes were always full of him, and when she looked at him, there was always an unmistakable tenderness and affection. She had known from a young age that she would be his wife, and he had known from a young age that he would marry her. So how did things come to this? When he really thought about it, how much did he truly love Diana? Most of it was just an outlet for his rebellion against his family, a way to defy his elders. He was tired of a life that was predictable, a life where every step was controlled. But what had Melissa done wrong? Her only mistake was loving him, wasn't it? Chapter 23. Mr. Zhao, if there's nothing else, please leave. It's getting late. Anthony wasn't interested in wasting time on a man like Simon. The night was short, and every moment he wanted to spend with Melissa. "Can I see her?" Simon reached out, blocking the door frame. "She's exhausted, probably too tired to see you." As a man, Anthony knew exactly how to twist the knife into another man's heart. But this was just the beginning. Simon's current pain was nothing. It could never compare to the years of yearning and unfulfilled desires that Anthony had endured. Simon's eyes were so red they looked like they were about to bleed. His knuckles pressed hard against the doorframe, the veins on the back of his hand bulging. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, each word seeming to scrape from his very soul. "I didn't sign the divorce papers. She's still Mrs. Zhao. Still my wife. Simon's wife. Sir, please step aside." Simon raised his hand, ready to push the door open, but Melissa's voice, soft and languid, sounded from within. "Anthony, why are you taking so long to come back? Is something wrong?" Simon had never heard Melissa speak in that tone before. There was a slight huskiness to her voice, soft yet carrying the warmth of spring. Her words were tinged with a playful affection, laced with an undeniable intimacy. It was the softest knife in the world, yet it was dipped in the deadliest poison. Simon knew he would never be okay again. The lesson was right in front of him, and yet, he had been foolish enough to repeat the same mistake. Chapter 24. Lissa, it's nothing. Don't worry. The moment Anthony turned back to look at me, I saw Simon standing outside the door. Our eyes met, and I couldn't tell what Simon was feeling. As for me, I only felt a moment of shock and surprise. Then, I nodded slightly at him and calmly asked, "Did you come to deliver the divorce papers?" "Actually, you can just have your lawyer contact me directly. We have no financial entanglements. The process is straightforward." "Melissa." Simon suddenly gave a bitter smile. "I didn't sign the papers. Melissa, I don't want a divorce." I was a bit surprised, but only just slightly. I could somewhat understand why Simon would say that. It's similar to when Eva left Diego, ending their relationship abruptly. People can form habits in as little as 21 days. But Eva and Diego had 7 years together. Simon and I grew up together. Childhood sweethearts, we had over 3 times that. Diego couldn't accept that Eva no longer loved him, that she was truly gone from his life. But perhaps time can smooth over all these discomforts. Simon is the same. A wife from a once powerful family. A woman who once truly loved him. Suddenly withdrawing all her affection. No longer dependent on him. It's understandable he would feel unsettled. But it doesn't matter. A younger, prettier girl will help him forget in time. Or maybe a girl who resembles Diana will make him fall again immediately. It's not that important. A man's love is just a joke. You laugh it off and move on. Anthony. I looked away from Simon and gently tugged on Anthony's arm. I think I might need a lawyer. Anthony smiled, with a hint of pride. Ming's legal department is unmatched in all of South City. If they can't handle it, I'll personally bring someone in to help. Who? I asked, curious. The only person I've ever truly respected. He's been abroad for years, so I haven't had a chance to introduce you to him. But it won't come to that. Yeah, just a simple divorce case. You just said, your name is Anthony? Simon suddenly spoke, his tone heavy. Yes, I'm Anthony. Simon's face grew dark and menacing. In the next instant, he suddenly swung his fist and punched Anthony in the face. It happened so quickly, I was still holding onto Anthony's arm. To avoid hurting me, he couldn't dodge in time. The punch landed heavily, leaving a gash on his face. Seeing him injured, I felt all the blood in my body freeze for a brief moment. For the first time in my life, I lost control and rushed to Simon, slapping him hard across the face. My sharp nails left a cut on Simon's cheek, but I still glared at him furiously. Get out of my home immediately. Melissa, you hit me for him? Simon touched the wound on his face and then looked up at me. You're hitting me for a scumbag who preys on other men's wives? You call her your wife. Simon, you've been married to her for 3 years, but have you ever treated her as your wife for even 1 day? 1 minute? Do you know that what you took for granted is something I, Anthony, could only dream of? Do you know how much it hurt me? How much I regretted it when I found out how much she had suffered these past 3 years? This is a private matter between me and Melissa. Nothing to do with you. Simon. Anthony's eyes grew cold, the blood on his split lip beginning to dry. He gave a bitter laugh, the pain and regret deepening in his gaze, back when Melissa got lost and went missing in the mountains. It was supposed to be me. Shut up. Simon's eyes were filled with panic and fear as he pushed me aside, trying to silence Anthony, but I stepped forward, placing myself between them. I looked up at Anthony, my voice steady but trembling. Anthony, finish what you were saying. Every single word. Tell me the whole truth. No lies. No deception. Chapter 25. Lissa. Anthony shook his head with a bitter smile. It's all in the past. There's no remedy for regret in this world. Yes, there's no remedy for regret. I looked at him, yet it felt as if I were looking through him, back at the person I was years ago. Back then, during our club's hiking trip, that mountain hadn't been fully developed into a tourist spot. Many areas didn't even have proper paths. I couldn't keep up with the group, got lost midway, and accidentally fell into a ravine, injuring my leg. Later, when I was cold, in pain, and slipping into unconsciousness, it was Simon who found me and saved me. Anthony's eyes lowered slightly, his expression restrained and calm, but the way his hands clenched tightly at his sides revealed the turmoil in his heart. The truth is, the first person who found me was you, wasn't it, Anthony? He suddenly looked up at me. Lissa. I saw the pain and struggle in his eyes, and the regret that wouldn't fade. I knew how much he was hurting, but I was hurting more. Back then, in our youth, we hurt those who liked us recklessly. But what's wrong with pure affection? What's wrong with liking someone without interfering or getting in the way? So what if he found you first? Melissa, you were my fiancé. Yet he coveted you and even pursued you. A man like that is nothing but deceitful. I didn't want him near you, so I lied to you. Was that wrong? And what about you? You had a fiancé, yet you deceived the innocent and kind-hearted Diana. You made her fall in love with you. only to abandon her and cause her death. Simon, you're the selfish, deceitful one. Diana's death wasn't an accident, and it wasn't caused by me, Melissa. Diana died because of your arrogance, cowardice, and indecision. But I'm not like Diana. I won't destroy myself over a man like you. Simon, don't ruin the last bit of affection we have from our youth. Sign the divorce papers. After saying this, I didn't spare him another glance. I just took Anthony's hand and said softly, I'll wait for you in the room. My hands are so cold. Come back soon and warm them for me. Chapter 26. That night, I'm not sure how Anthony managed to send a drunken Simon away. All I know is that just a few minutes after I returned to the bedroom, Anthony followed me in. Melissa. Anthony hugged me tightly, pressing my cool hands against his abdomen. When I opened the door earlier, I told that Zhao guy that you were my wife. MHM. You're not angry, are you? MHM. Then do you want to be my wife? You found me first back then. Why didn't you tell me? You said you hated me, that I annoyed you, and told me to get lost as far away as possible. Anthony's voice held a hint of grievance. Was I really that annoying back then? I couldn't help but think of how Anthony was in those days. Tall and athletic. He loved playing basketball and was always tanned. Though he was handsome, his smile was a bit goofy. Back then, he didn't exactly fit my aesthetic. The younger Melissa was drawn to refined, elegant, and gentle boys like Simon in his youth. It seems you really can't judge a book by its cover. The man who seemed unreliable back then turned out to be someone who loved with his whole heart, while the gentle, affectionate boy was always indecisive and wavering. Actually, you weren't that annoying. Anthony, I'm sorry. Don't say sorry, Melissa. Anthony, can you say those words you used when you first pursued me again? Anthony seemed a bit uneasy, clearing his throat before awkwardly saying, Melissa, I really like you. Will you be my girlfriend? In the dimly lit room, his eyes were still as bright as ever, bright enough to make my heart soften. I smiled up at him and kissed him lightly. I'll say yes this time. Chapter 27. When Simon's signed divorce papers arrived, Alicia's evening qipao was also finished. I called her to arrange a time for her to pick it up. Alicia arrived as scheduled, but her usually bright, smiling eyes were clouded with sorrow. She looked at the finished qipao, lovingly caressing it, but as she looked up at me, tears suddenly welled up in her eyes. I'm sorry, Lissa. I originally wanted to wear this qipao to the engagement party, to show all the socialites in South City how amazing your designs are. But now, she was crying. Yet she forced a smile at me. I'm not going to get engaged anymore. So I'm really sorry. Lissa. Alicia. Did something happen? I pulled her to sit down, handing her a tissue, and gently asked. Alicia was still so young, her cheeks soft and rosy, her tears falling as she tried to keep smiling. Lucas decided to be with that girl who's been chasing him for 7 or 8 years. Her smile finally broke, shattering and fading away, until those beautiful almond-shaped eyes became empty. He always said he hated her, that he was annoyed by her persistence. He said she was a nuisance, that she drove him crazy. There were so many times he humiliated her in public. At their class reunion, when she pretended to be drunk and fell into his arms, he almost hit her. But now, when she heard about his engagement, she threatened to kill herself. He was in a meeting at the time, but he sped to her house without a second thought, and he slept with her. He said, Sandra told him it was her only wish in life, to be with him as his woman, and if she couldn't have that, she'd end her life. He said he had no choice, that he couldn't just watch her die. He said it was like being bitten by a dog. And now it's over. Everything's settled, and no one will bother us anymore. Alicia gripped my hand tightly, her tears falling like broken pearls onto my hand. But Lissa, if you really hate someone, would you sleep with them? My heart ached terribly, and I held her tightly. Alicia, it's okay. Let it all out. Cry as much as you need. Lissa, I've cried enough. After telling you today, I won't cry for him anymore. Yuan. Lissa, you have to be happy. Brother Chen really loves you. You're so lucky. She said she wouldn't cry anymore, and true to her word, She wiped her tears and started smiling again. I felt a deep sadness, wanting to comfort her, but knowing that no amount of comforting words would help. She would have to find her way out of this on her own. I watched as Alicia turned and left. Her figure was slender but stubborn. As I looked at her, it was like looking at my past self, and tears began to fall from my eyes without me realizing it. Chapter 28. On the day Anthony and I got married, Eva and Alex made a special trip from Hong Kong to South City to attend our wedding. I didn't invite any friends or relatives from Beijing, but there were still some who came uninvited. Diego brought many expensive wedding gifts. He didn't say it, but I knew that some of them were from Simon, perhaps out of consideration for Eva and Alex. Diego left before the wedding ended. It was a busy day, and Anthony and I didn't get a chance to see him off, so we didn't know that in the Bentley waiting outside the wedding venue. Simon was sitting there as well. Chapter 29. Were the gifts delivered? They were. Did she say anything? Diego shook his head. She just thanked me. Simon gave a bitter smile and took one last look at the place filled with blooming flowers. Let's go back. I saw Eva. She's pregnant. Alex is very attentive, taking great care of her. Diego smiled again, but this time, there was a sense of relief in it. It doesn't hurt as much as it did when I first heard she was getting married. He patted Simon on the shoulder. Time will smooth everything out. You'll get through it, and it'll get better. Simon didn't say anything that snowy night, when he saw Anthony at the door. When he saw the tangled mess of clothes on the floor, he knew he would never be able to reconcile with himself for the rest of his life. What he had taken from Anthony was now returned, untouched. It was karma in its purest form. Chapter 30. In the second year after our marriage, my only remaining relative, my brother Angelo, passed away peacefully in his sleep from heart failure. He had once been a bright and promising young man, but the last few years of his life were spent confined to a bed. He never had the chance to fulfill his ambitions. Perhaps this ending was more of a release for him. That same year, my studio expanded several times over and began to make a name for itself in South City. The following year, I found out I was pregnant. It turned out to be twins, a boy and a girl. Anthony was overjoyed, even shedding tears. There's nothing more satisfying than seeing the dreams of your youth come true. I hugged him tightly and whispered in his ear, Anthony, we have a lifetime ahead of us. During the time when my life was in freefall, he held me up and helped me rebuild, and what I can give him in return is undivided love and a lifetime of companionship.